All right. Consider the Musk argument. This is on your handout. It's inspired by an argument from Jonathan. I froze. I forgot his name. Never mind. You know the one I mean. The famous paper on closure from a long time ago. Consider the Musk argument. It's on your handout. 1M, Elon Musk is one of the richest people in the world. 2M, if Elon Musk is one of the richest people in the world, then he did not die of a heart attack 30 seconds ago. Jonathan Vogel. Therefore, 3M, Elon Musk did not die of a heart attack 30 seconds ago. I know that the Musk argument is valid. It can seem that I'm justified in believing its premises, and it can seem that I'm not justified in believing its conclusion. So it can seem, it can just seem this way, that my epistemic situation with regard to the Musk argument is a counterexample to the view that justification is closed under known entailment. So it can seem that the Musk argument, along with other more familiar arguments, threaten closure. But I will argue that the Musk argument is not a real threat to closure. More precisely, I will argue that arguments relevantly like the Musk argument are not a real threat to, this is closure principle 1, this is really my principle thing, main thing I want to defend. I'll call it CP1. It's on your handout. Suppose you believe a claim because it is the conclusion of an argument. You know that that argument's premises entail its conclusion, and you are justified in believing, or know, that that argument's premises are all true. Then you're justified in believing, or you could do this with knowledge, that that claim is true. I'm also going to argue for some other points along the way. We're also going to encounter and respond to a serious threat to the philosophical practice of giving arguments to justify conclusions. That's what we'll do today. Section 1. I want to begin by asking this question. Does the Musk argument justify its conclusion? For starters, pretend, just for the sake of argument, that the Musk argument is not valid. Then it fails to justify its conclusion and fails because it's not valid. Then the Musk argument's premises do not entail its conclusion. Then no one knows that the Musk argument's premises entail its conclusion. Then no one's epistemic situation with regard to the Musk argument is a counterexample to justification being closed under known entailment. Okay. Or suppose that the Musk argument fails to justify its conclusion because no one is justified in believing its premises. Then again, no one's situation with regard to the Musk argument is a counterexample to justification being closed under known entailment. Suppose that the Musk argument is circular in the following way. No one could be justified in believing the Musk argument's first premise unless they were already justified in believing its conclusion. Then, in my opinion, the Musk argument fails to justify its conclusion. So it is false that its conclusion is justified for someone by way of their being justified in believing that that argument is sound. Even so, there is no one who is justified in believing its premises who is not already justified in believing its conclusion. That was just what we assumed, that it was circular in that way. So if the Musk argument is thus circular, no one's situation with regard to that argument is a counterexample to justification being closed under known entailment. So someone's situation with regard to the Musk argument is a counterexample to closure with regard to justification only if that argument is not circular in the way just noted, and that person is both justified in believing that that argument's premises are true and also knows that that argument is valid. That is, that person is justified in believing that that argument is sound. Let's give a fighting chance to the claim that the Musk argument threatens closure with regard to justification. In particular, let's give a fighting chance to the claim that your epistemic situation with regard to the Musk argument is a counterexample to closure with regard to justification in general and to what CP1 says about justification in particular. Then we must assume both that you are justified in believing that the Musk argument is sound, and also that you can be justified in believing this without already being justified in believing that its conclusion is true. With CP1 in mind, we must also assume that you believe the Musk's argument's conclusion because it is the conclusion of that argument. I don't know if all those assumptions are right, but suppose they are. Then I claim that the Musk argument justifies its conclusion for you. And so you are justified in believing that the conclusion of the Musk argument is true. I know that claim, that if we make those assumptions, that Musk argument justifies the conclusion for you, is controversial. We'll call that the controversial move. I think this and parallel moves in this section are the only things controversial I'm defending at all in this section. So I have a lot more to say in defense of these moves, but most of that will wait until section 3. I'll come back to this. We might not agree on whether the Musk argument is circular in the way described above, or on whether we're justified in believing its premises are true, and so on. So we might not agree on how to evaluate the Musk argument as an argument that aims to justify its conclusion. But I think that we've just seen, at least given that controversial move that we'll come back to, that however you end up thus evaluating the Musk argument, you should deny that that argument leads to a counterexample to closure with regard to justification in general, or to what CP1 says about justification in particular. Let me reinforce some of the points just made and make some further related points by discussing a couple of other more familiar arguments that also might seem to pose counterexamples to closure with regard to justification. Dretske takes the following series of claims, which I will assemble into an argument to show that neither knowledge nor justification is closed under known entailment. So this is on your handout. 1Z, the animal before me at the zoo is a zebra. 2Z, if the animal before me at the zoo is a zebra, then it is not a mule disguised as a zebra. Therefore, 3Z, the animal before me at the zoo is not a mule disguised as a zebra. If you are not justified in believing that the premises of the zebra argument are true, or do not know that those premises entail its conclusion, then your situation with regard to the zebra argument is not a counterexample to closure with regard to justification. And if the zebra argument is circular in the way described above, then again, your situation with regard to the zebra argument is not a counterexample to closure with regard to justification. So when what follows, let us assume, if only for the sake of argument, both that you are justified in believing that the zebra argument is sound, and also that the zebra argument is not circular in the way I described above. Dretske claims you're not justified in believing 3Z. He motivates this claim in lots of different ways, but here's a representative remark. The evidence you had for thinking them zebras does not count toward their not being mules cleverly disguised to look like zebras. Have you checked with the zoo authorities? Did you examine the animals closely enough to detect such a fraud? You might do this, of course, but in most cases you do nothing of the kind. Dretske's remarks leave out an epistemically relevant fact concerning your believing 3Z. This is the fact that 3Z is the conclusion of the zebra argument, and, we're assuming this, you're justified in believing that that argument is sound. I say that this fact is an excellent reason for us to conclude that you are justified in believing 3Z. I know that move's controversial. I'm going to come back to it, section 3. I've been defending some points about closure with regard to justification. I think parallel points hold for closure with regard to knowledge. So let's explicitly focus on knowledge as we consider the BIV argument. It's also on your hands. It's also on your handout, which is in your hands because you're not a brain in a vat. All right. 1B, you have hands. 2B, if you have hands, then you're not a brain in a vat. Therefore, 3B, you are not a brain in a vat. Your situation with regard to the BIV argument is a counterexample to knowledge being closed under entailment only if you do not know that its conclusion is true. But that is not all that such a counterexample requires. Such a counterexample also requires that you both know that the premises of the BIV argument are true and also know that those premises entail that argument's conclusion. So let's assume you do know this. In other words, let's assume you know that the BIV argument is sound. Now add to this assumption that you believe the BIV's argument's conclusion because it is the conclusion of that argument. Then I say that you know that that conclusion is true, so your situation with regard to the BIV argument is not a counterexample to closure with regard to knowledge. Look at it this way. Suppose you take your situation with regard to the BIV argument to be a counterexample to closure with regard to knowledge. Then you deny that you know that you are not a brain in a vat. I understand why you might deny this. After all, the topic of brains and vats makes salient scenarios in which you're massively deceived. And many take such salience to be epistemically relevant. But note that if you believe the conclusion of the BIV argument because it is the conclusion of the BIV argument is also salient. At any rate, when asking whether you know that you're not a brain in a vat, it would be a mistake to ignore the fact that you know that you have a sound argument for the conclusion that you are not a brain in a vat. So if you ask, how could I know that I'm not a brain in a vat? I would reply, you could know this by way of argument, in particular by knowing that the BIV argument is sound. Others would endorse this, of course, G.E. Moore, other more recent people, but more people would object. So I'll return to this move in section 3. You might object that you could not know that you are a brain in a vat by way of knowing that the BIV argument is sound, because you could not know that the argument is sound without already knowing that you're not a brain in a vat. That's fine. But of course, if that objection is right, then you do know that But if that objection is right, and if you do know that the BIV argument is sound, then you also know that you're not a brain in a vat. So your situation with regard to the BIV argument is not a counterexample to closure with regard to knowledge. You might deny that you really do know that the BIV argument is sound, and deny this even if you believe that it is sound. That's also fine. But if you do not know that the BIV argument is sound, then as already noted, your situation with regard to that argument is not a counterexample to closure with regard to knowledge. Into that section, take a sip of water between sections, because, I don't know, I always do. Section 2, the Kruskey argument. Kripke considers arguments like the following, which I'll call the Kruskey argument. 1K, Elon Musk is one of the richest people in the world. 2K, if Elon Musk is one of the richest people in the world, then any evidence against Musk's being one of the richest people in the world is misleading. Therefore, 3K, any evidence against Musk's being one of the richest people in the world is misleading. Suppose that you know that this argument is sound. Add that you believe its conclusion because it is the conclusion of this argument. Then given CP1, and of course the reasoning of section 1, you know that its conclusion is true. Some might take this to be a reason to reject CP1. They might deny that you could know that 3K is true on the basis of the Kruskey argument. They might deny this for two reasons. These are two reasons that don't apply to the earlier arguments. That's why it's getting its own section. First reason is contained in Kripke's remark. Here's what Kripke says. This already seems very strange, that just by knowing some common or garden variety statement, which I'm calling P, one knows a sweeping thing, that any evidence against P is misleading. I object that the claim that the conclusion of the Kruskey argument is true is not more sweeping than the claim that the Kruskey argument is sound. More generally, I think that for any argument, once you know that that argument is sound, there's nothing very strange in your knowing that its conclusion is true. Second reason concerns objectionable dogmatism. Kripke thinks that if you know that any evidence against P is misleading, then you should avoid evidence against P and ignore such evidence when you're unable to avoid it. But, so I will now argue, it's false that your knowing that evidence against P is misleading implies that you should avoid evidence against P and ignore such evidence when you're unable to avoid it. Suppose that you know that the Kruskey argument is sound. Add that you know that its conclusion is true only because you know that that argument is sound. But then you read on the New York Times homepage that Musk has just died. I say that this evidence from the Times defeats your knowledge that Musk is one of the richest people in the world. That is, once you encounter this evidence, I think that you no longer know that Musk is one of the richest people in the world. So you no longer know that the Kruskey argument has all two premises. So you no longer know that the Kruskey argument is sound. So you no longer know that that argument's conclusion is true by way of knowing that that argument is sound. So you no longer know that its conclusion is true. That is, you no longer know that any evidence against Musk's being one of the richest people in the world is misleading. So you should not ignore this evidence from the Times to the effect that Musk is not one of the world's richest people. So objectionable dogmatism is averted. That little speech I just gave, that's Gil Harmon. That was his kind of response to Kripke. I'm agreeing with it. I'm going to now build on it. But the little bit I made was not, I wasn't the first one to say that. Again, even if you start out knowing that the conclusion of the Musk argument is true because you know that that argument is sound, you should not ignore evidence from the Times to the effect that Musk is not one of the world's richest people when you encounter that evidence. And because you should not ignore that evidence when you do encounter it, I think that if you were to encounter such evidence, it would be a mistake to ignore it. So I think that you should not try to avoid such evidence even if you have not yet encountered it. Again, objectionable dogmatism is averted. Contrast all this with the following case. I learned from a trusted and reliable source that hackers have posted a fabricated article on the New York Times website saying that Musk has just died. So let us add, I know that any evidence on the Times website to the effect that Musk has just died is misleading. In this case, I think that I should ignore any evidence that I encounter on the Times website to the effect that Musk has just died. I think this is at least in part because the evidence on the Times website does not defeat my knowledge about the hackers. So the moral here is that the correct attitude toward evidence that you now know is misleading is not, as Kripke seems to assume, a result only of your knowing that that evidence is misleading. The correct attitude is also a result of how you know that that evidence is misleading and how that evidence bears on how you know that. In particular, the correct attitude toward evidence that you start out knowing is misleading is at least partly a result of whether that evidence defeats your knowledge of the claim that said evidence is misleading. The zebra argument is in an important way like the Kruski argument. For any defeater for the conclusion of the zebra argument will also be a defeater for its first premise. As a result, your knowing that the conclusion of the zebra argument is true, if you know that by way of the zebra argument, does not even suggest that you should ignore or try to avoid evidence to the effect that the animal before you at the zoo is a disguised mule. I think this makes it even easier to accept the claim that you could know that the conclusion of the zebra argument is true by way of knowing that the zebra argument is sound. Of course, the parallel point holds for the Musk and the BIV arguments as well. Suppose that someone announces that they know that any evidence against P is misleading, and suppose we believe them. I think we would assume they know this not merely because they know that this follows from P, which they also know. We would assume that they know this for some other reason, such as, for example, that they know this because they know that hackers have posted misleading evidence to the effect that P is false. All this explains why the following claim can sound plausible. If you know that evidence against P is misleading, then you should ignore such evidence. But the Kruski argument shows that this plausible sounding claim is false, at least when taken in full generality. Again, suppose someone announces that they know that any evidence against P is misleading. Suppose we believe them. We then ask how they know this. I think we'd be really disappointed if they answer that they know it because it follows from P, which they also know. For we would expect them to answer with something relevantly like a story about hackers who mislead about P. Now, suppose someone announces that they know that the animal before them is not a mule disguised as a zebra. We then ask how they know this. I think we'd be disappointed if they answer by way of the zebra argument. We would expect them to answer in terms of their close observations and equine knowledge. This is another important way in which the zebra argument is like the Kruski argument. Likewise for the Musk and the BIV argument. Into that section. All right. Section 3, in defense of closure principle 1. I recognize that the Musk argument and the zebra argument and the BIV argument all seem to be, in an important way, unlike arguments philosophers usually give. Perhaps we need to account for this seeming. One way to account for this seeming is to say that these arguments lead to counterexamples to CP1, whereas the arguments philosophers usually give do not. But there are other ways to account for this seeming, some of which are perfectly consistent with CP1. Section 2 showed us just one way. These arguments are disappointing in the way described in that section. Not at all what we would expect if someone announced they had an argument for the relevant conclusion. Section 2 also showed us that CP1 does not imply an objectionable dogmatism, so no one should deny CP1 on the grounds that it implies an objectionable dogmatism. More generally, no one should deny CP1 at all, or that's what I'm going to argue now. My argument begins by observing that some beliefs are properly basic in Plantinga's sense. That is, they are justified, but not on the basis of argument. Maybe some perceptual beliefs are like this. Maybe some episodic memory beliefs are like this. Maybe your belief that you exist is like this. But the belief that CP1 is false is not like this. Instead, the belief that CP1 is false, if justified at all, would have to be justified on the basis of argument. Now, suppose for the sake of argument that CP1 is false. Then you're being justified in believing that you have a sound argument for the conclusion that CP1 is false, and believing that conclusion because it is the conclusion of that argument would not imply that you are justified in believing that conclusion. This is a general point applicable to any reasoning that alleges to justify the claim that CP1 is false. I'll give you 3 examples. First one, inspired by Nozick. Suppose you endorse a particular analysis of knowledge. Suppose you're justified in believing that you have a sound argument for that analysis. Suppose that you know that that analysis entails that CP1 is false. Add that CP1 is false. Then all that we have supposed does not on its own, imply that you're justified in believing that CP1 is false. Here's another example, again inspired by Nozick. Suppose that you endorse the principle known as sensitivity, which says that if you know that P, then you would not believe P if P were false. Sensitivity famously implies that you can know of some conjunction that it is true, but fail to know that one of its conjuncts is true. Thus, sensitivity entails that knowledge is not closed under known entailment, and in particular that CP1 is false. But suppose that CP1 is false, then being justified in believing that sensitivity is true, even when combined with knowing that sensitivity entails that CP1 is false, would not on its own, imply that you are justified in believing that CP1 is false. Here's one last example. Suppose you're justified in believing the following three claims about what you are and are not justified in believing. This is on your handout. The three claims that this example suppose you're justified believing are, here they are. You are justified in believing that the animal before you at the zoo is a zebra. You are justified in believing that if the animal before you at the zoo is a zebra, it is not a mule disguised as a zebra. You are not justified in believing that that animal is not a mule disguised as a zebra. Given all that we have just assumed, you are justified in believing claims that entail, let's add that you know that they entail, that CP1 is false. So you are justified in believing that you have a sound argument for the falsity of CP1. Add that you believe that CP1 is false because it is the conclusion of that argument. But if CP1 is false, none of this implies that you are justified in believing that CP1 is false. In other words, if CP1 is false, you're being justified in believing that Dretschke's argument for the falsity of CP1 is sound does not imply that you're justified in believing that CP1 is false. Parallel point holds for arguments for the falsity of CP1 by way of the Musk argument or the BIV argument or the Kruski argument. Before this section is over, I will consider the idea that arguments for the falsity of CP1 have some features that, in addition to being justifiably believed to be sound, allow them to justify their respective conclusions. But for now, just a little bit, let's assume that those arguments do not have any such additional features. Let's assume for now that the arguments for the falsity of CP1 are nothing more than arguments that are believed with justification to be sound. That is assuming a lot. Like normally you'd be thrilled if you said that about your arguments. I would. Still, given what we are assuming, if CP1 is false, nothing about these arguments implies that anyone is justified in believing that CP1 is false, not even someone who believes that CP1 is false because it is the conclusion of one of these arguments. So given what we are assuming, and if CP1 is false, none of these arguments justify their conclusion that CP1 is false, not even for those who are justified in believing that these arguments are sound. The belief that CP1 is false would, if justified at all, have to be justified on the basis of argument. So no one is justified in believing that CP1 is false. And for parallel reasons, no one knows that CP1 is false. That is, if CP1 is false, then no one is justified in believing or knows that CP1 is false. CP1 is true or CP1 is false. If CP1 is true, then it is a mistake to deny it. If CP1 is false, then so I've just argued, no one is justified in believing or knows that CP1 is false. So I conclude that no one should deny CP1, either because that denial is mistaken or because that denial is not justified. You should not deny CP1. On the contrary, you should endorse CP1, for there are good reasons to endorse it. One familiar reason is that closure principles along the lines of CP1 are initially quite plausible. Even Dretschke says, here's Dretschke, I'll quote him, "Yes, closure sounds like an eminently plausible principle. Everything else being equal, then we ought to keep it." Everything else would not be equal if there were an argument that justified the conclusion that CP1 is false. But I've just argued, at least if CP1 is false, that the arguments for the falsity fail to justify their conclusions. I think there's still more to be said in support of CP1. That more begins by supposing, again for the sake of argument, that CP1 is false. If CP1 is false, then the problems that afflict the above arguments for the falsity of CP1 afflict all arguments. This includes all the arguments I've been defending in this section and in this paper. This also includes your own personal most favorite argument. Consider an argument you've come up with, the argument you're most proud of. or an argument you've encountered, the one you're most impressed by. If CP1 is false, you're believing that argument's conclusion because it is the conclusion of that argument, and you're being justified in believing that that argument is sound, is not sufficient for your being justified in believing that conclusion. I think that is a serious threat to the philosophical practice of giving arguments to justify conclusions. And a parallel point holds for giving arguments to render conclusions known. Keeping all this in mind, let's turn to some remarks that Dretske makes in an exchange with Hawthorne. Dretske says, quoting Dretske, "This strikes me at best as a bit of verbal hocus pocus. We simply stipulate that we know whatever we know to be implied by what we know, even though we have no identifiable way of knowing it. In rejecting this option, I assume, of course, that the visual appearance of a zebra, the sort of perceptual condition that normally leads one to say that one can see that it is a zebra, is not evidence, is not itself a reason to think that the zoo authorities did not replace the zebras with mules painted to look like zebras." End of that Dretske quote. In this passage, Dretske endorses perception as an identifiable way of knowing a claim, and elsewhere in the same paper he endorses memory and testimony. But he seems here to definitely deny that the following is an identifiable way of knowing a claim. You know it by knowing that it is entailed by other claims that you know. Dretske thereby commits himself to denying that the following is an identifiable way of knowing a claim. You know it by knowing that it is the conclusion of an argument that you know is sound. Please indulge me while I point out that Dretske should say it would be verbal hocus pocus to claim that we know that CP1 is false because we know that he's given a sound argument involving zebras for the falsity of CP1. Here's a closely related point. Dretske says that the perceptual appearance that justifies your believing the zebra argument's first premise, namely that the animal before you is a zebra, does not also justify its conclusion, namely that that animal is not a mule disguised as a zebra. Let's agree that he's right. Dretske takes this to imply that the zebra argument does not justify its conclusion. But I object that the conclusion of the zebra argument does not need to be justified by what justifies its first premise. On the contrary, I claim that you could be justified in believing the conclusion of the zebra argument by way of being justified in believing that it is the conclusion of a sound argument. This is perfectly consistent with its first premise being justified by a perceptual experience. I think that some claims are justified only on the basis of argument. So far as I can see, Dretske leaves no room for this. So far as I can see, Dretske thinks that whatever might seem to be justified on the basis of argument must also be justified in some other way, such as by the perceptual experience that justifies a key premise. So far as I can see, Dretske is committed to the view that every justified belief is properly basic. It's no coincidence that Dretske both rejects closure and is also committed to the claim that the philosophical practice of giving arguments to justify conclusions is verbal hocus pocus. For if CP1 is false, then there is at the very least a real threat to that practice. To see why I say this, assume that you're justified in believing the conclusion of some arguments that you're justified in believing are sound, but then add that CP1 is false. Then we should endorse CP1 plus. This is on your handout. Suppose that you believe a claim because it is the conclusion of an argument. You know that that argument's premises entail its conclusion, and you are justified in believing, or know, that that argument's premises are all true. That argument has additional features x1 through xn. Then you are justified in believing or know that claim. So it's just CP1 with the and the argument isn't like the zebra argument. Most of us do not even have an opinion on what x1 through xn are. So we can't even pretend to identify which arguments have x1 through xn. So I say that once we deny CP1, we should be agnostic about which of the arguments that we believe with justification to be sound have justified conclusions. That is, we should be agnostic about this unless we are already justified in believing a conclusion for reasons that have nothing to do with the argument for it. So we should not ever say that this or that argument is what justifies its conclusion. And this is a serious threat to our practice of giving arguments to justify conclusions. Above, I said I would consider the claim that an argument for the falsity of CP1 has some features in addition to being justifiably believed to be sound, in virtue of which it justifies its conclusion. With this and CP1 plus in mind, Suppose that some insist that an argument justifies the claim that CP1 is false because that argument is believed with justification to be sound, and moreover, it has x1 through xn. Then they will have a way to object to my argument above for the claim that if CP1 is false, then no one should deny CP1. But their objection makes no difference, for they cannot say what x1 through xn are, so they should not ever say of an argument that it justifies the conclusion that CP1 is false, so I still think that no one should deny CP1. Again, most of us have no opinion on what x1 through xn are. So I said we can't even pretend to identify which arguments have x1 through xn. So I said that once we deny CP1, we should be agnostic about which of the arguments that we believe with justification to be sound have justified conclusions. But someone might disagree. Some might insist that they can just tell which arguments, when believed with justification to be sound, have justified conclusions. And they can tell this even though they cannot say what x1 through xn are. I don't know how they can tell this. Perhaps they will say they have a cognitive faculty, a sensus argumentatus, that lets them identify which of the arguments that are believed with justification to be sound also have conclusions that are believed with justification to be true. Maybe they say it's like chicken sexing. There are things you could say. But whatever they say, I think that trading CP1 for CP1 plus makes it mysterious how we know, if we do know, that an argument we are justified in believing is sound is an argument whose conclusion we are justified in believing, and that this mystery threatens the philosophical practice of giving arguments to justify conclusions. I myself think that there's no need to monger mystery here or to manufacture a threat to the philosophical practice of giving arguments to justify conclusions. For I think that we've known all along that you are justified in believing a conclusion of an argument if you are justified in believing that that argument is sound, at least when you believe the conclusion because it is the conclusion of that argument. Parallel point holds for arguments that you know are sound. I think that all this constitutes a good reason to endorse CP1. And once we endorse CP1, we should also endorse the controversial move made over and over again in Section 1. For example, we should agree that if you know that the BIV argument is sound, then you know you're not a brain in a vat. End of that section. Three points regarding contextualism. Section 4. Suppose you utter the following three sentences. These are on your handout. I know that Elon Musk is one of the richest people in the world. I know that if Elon Musk is one of the richest people in the world, then he did not die of a heart attack 30 seconds ago. I do not know that Elon Musk did not die of a heart attack 30 seconds ago. Now consider contextualists who deny that the word know denotes the same mental state or relation to a proposition, whatever, in all the sentences just mentioned. For example, these contextualists might say that when you utter sentence 1, the word know denotes know sub 6. When you utter sentence 3, that word denotes know sub 1. These contextualists can then say that you speak only the truth when you utter the above three sentences, and they can say this without thereby implying that knowledge is not closed under known entailment. I think I have to say something about contextualism, but I don't want to say too much because it's a big topic, and it's not the topic of this paper. So I'm only going to make 3 points about contextualism, points that are directly relevant to the views defended so far. I will make these points about contextualism as I've just described it, but I think it should be clear that they're going to apply to fancier versions that add some things and to contrastivism and other kind of similar views. All right, contextualism offers a diagnosis of what is going on when the word know is used in sentences concerning the premises and conclusions of arguments relevantly like the Musk argument. Moreover, contextualism's diagnosis does not imply that knowledge is not closed under known entailment. All this is a central motivation for contextualism. Section 1 presented my diagnosis of what's going on with regard to knowledge and arguments relevantly like the Musk argument. And of course, my diagnosis is consistent with knowledge being closed under known entailment. Anyone who agrees with my diagnosis does not need the contextualist's diagnosis. So anyone who agrees with my diagnosis should not find motivating the aforementioned motivation for contextualism. That's 1 point. That's the first point. Some contextualists might reply that those who agree with their diagnosis do not need my diagnosis from Section 1. I disagree. One reason I disagree is that my diagnosis focuses on both knowledge and also justification. Contextualism's diagnosis focuses on the word know, but does not, at least not typically, focus on the word justification, and not at all on justification. So contextualism does not offer a way to defend the practice of being justified in believing a claim by way of being justified in believing that an argument for that claim is sound. But I think we should defend this practice and defend it from threats like those involving the Muss argument. That's my second point about contextualism. Suppose, just for the sake of argument, that contextualists are right in how they diagnose what is going on when the word no is used in sentences concerning the premises and conclusion of the Muss argument. Still, unanswered questions about closure remain. For example, suppose that the word no denotes no sub 6 when you utter the sentence, I know that Musk is one of the richest people in the world. And suppose that your utterance is true. Contextualism, as described above and all on its own, does not answer this question. Does the Musk argument lead to a counterexample to knowledge sub 6 being closed under known sub 6 entailment? But if we combine contextualism with the reasoning in section 1, we can answer this question. For given that reasoning, if you know sub 6 that the Musk argument is sound, then you know sub 6 that Musk did not die of a heart attack 30 seconds ago. And then the Musk argument does not lead to a counterexample to closure with regard to knowledge sub 6. On the other hand, if you do not know sub 6 that the Musk argument is sound, then again, the Musk argument does not lead to a counterexample to closure with regard to knowledge sub 6. So we have another reason that contextualism doesn't do away with the usefulness of the diagnosis in section 1, not even when that diagnosis is focused on knowledge as opposed to justification. This reason is that section 1's diagnosis can be adapted by contextualists to defend closure within a context. And most, not all, but most contextualists do endorse closure within a context. In other words, most contextualists say that knowledge sub 1 is closed under known sub 1 entailment, knowledge sub 2 is closed under knowledge sub known sub 2 entailment, and so on. All this allows contextualists to endorse the philosophical practice of knowing sub 1 that a claim is true by way of knowing sub 1 that you have a sound argument for that claim, and so on. But contextualists cannot endorse the practice of knowing simpliciter that a claim is true by way of just knowing that you have a sound argument for that claim, at least if that's opposed to, for example, the practice of knowing sub 1 that the claim is true by way of knowing that you sub 1 that you have a sound argument for that claim, so on. This is because contextualists must deny that there's such a thing as knowing, at least as opposed to knowing sub 1 or knowing sub 2 or knowing sub 3. This amounts, I mean, you tell me if it amounts. This does amount to an objection to contextualism for those who think that we should defend the practice of knowing that a claim is true by way of knowing that you have a sound argument for that claim. Right. Third, final point about contextualism. Just one more section. The preface argument. With the paradox of the preface in mind, let the premises of the preface argument be all and only the claims that you believe with justification. So you are justified in believing of each and every premise of this argument that it is true. Add that the preface argument's conclusion is the conjunction of its premises. So this argument is valid, and you know that it is valid. Let us assume, for the sake of argument, that you are not justified in believing that the conclusion of the preface argument is true. This assumption is more plausible the more justified beliefs you have. So let's assume that you have a lot of justified beliefs as opposed to, say, 2. We are assuming that you're not justified in believing that the conclusion of the preface argument is true. But let's also assume that you do in fact believe that its conclusion is true, and believe this because it is the conclusion of the preface argument. Given all we're assuming, we get the result that your epistemic situation with regard to the preface argument is a counterexample to closure principle 2 on your handout. Suppose that you believe a claim because it is the conclusion of an argument, that you know that that argument's premises entail its conclusion, and you are justified in believing, or you could do it with no, that each of that argument's premises is true. Then you're justified in believing that claim. But if your situation with regard to the preface argument is a counterexample to CP2, then it is not a counterexample to CP1. This is because your situation is a counterexample to CP2 only if you are not justified in believing the conclusion of the preface argument. So it is a counterexample to CP2 only if you are not justified in believing that the conjunction of that argument's premises is true. So it is a counterexample to CP2 only if you are not justified in believing that all of that argument's premises are true. And if you are not justified in believing that that argument's premises are all true, your situation with regard to that argument is not a counterexample to CP1. The preface argument is no threat to the philosophical practice of giving arguments in order to justify conclusions. This is because if you were justified in believing that the preface argument is sound, and so justified in believing that it has all true premises, then you would be justified in believing that its conclusion is true. And the philosophical practice of giving arguments to justify conclusions is consistent with the fact that only arguments that you are justified in believing are sound can justify you in believing their conclusions. The preface argument involves justification, but now consider an argument whose premises are all the claims that you know are true, and whose conclusion is their conjunction. Suppose you do not know that this argument's conclusion is true. Then you do not know that the conjunction of the premises of this argument is true. So you do not know that all the premises of this argument are true. So you do not know that this argument is sound. Thus, this argument poses no threat to CP1 or to the practice of your coming to know a conclusion by way of knowing that you have a sound argument for that conclusion. There are other familiar arguments that are relevantly like the preface argument. They're relevantly like the preface argument because they have so many premises. Consider a lottery argument. Here are its premises. Ticket 1 is a loser, ticket 2 is a loser, ... ticket 10,000 is a loser. I say you can be justified in believing that each premise is true, but not justified in believing that all of them are true, and so not be justified in believing that the lottery argument is sound. The Musk argument has two premises. Suppose that you know that each premise of the Musk argument is true. Then I think you know that all of the premises of the Musk argument are true. How many premises are enough for an argument to be like the preface argument as opposed to like the Musk argument? That is, how many premises are enough for you to be justified in believing that each of those premises is true, but not justified in believing that all of them are true? 37. Thank you. That was kind. Just kidding. I have no idea how many premises are enough. I suspect we have here, I'm sure we have here, the makings of a Sorites series. Such a Sorites series would indicate that it can be vague whether you are justified in believing that all of an argument's premises are true, and that this can be vague even if you are justified in believing that each of the premises are true. This conference is in honor of Peter van Inwagen. So Peter, if I understand the conventions, I'm now supposed to criticize you, or at least something that you've written. Here goes. Peter gives a definition of the expression successful argument that, so he successfully argues, has virtually no argument for an interesting philosophical conclusion in its extension. And my criticism of Peter is that his way of defining the expression successful argument is misleading. For I think that Peter is justified in believing some really interesting philosophical claims only because of his arguments for those claims. And I think it would be misleading to say that arguments that justify interesting philosophical claims are not successful. That's all.
Hi, Trenton.
Hey, Ted.
I have a question about the argument in section 3, not the XYZ bit, but I mean the X1 to XN bit, but the first bit.
Okay.
I was a little confused by that. So suppose that I believe something on the basis of some argument, A, B, C, therefore the conclusion. So if the closure principle isn't true, then not every case of coming to believe something on the basis of an argument where you know the premises and you know that it's valid is a case where you know the premise or you're justified. Sorry, you know the conclusion or you're justified in it. But this might be one of the exceptions. The fact that so you say it doesn't follow from the fact that we have here a valid argument whose premises are known and the validity is known that you know the conclusion. But it still might be true.
That's right.
It still might be true that you know it on the basis of A, B, and C, and your knowledge that it's valid.
Yes, but
So
not solely because
yes,
you know
I don't
it's
see
valid.
that there's any argument yet that you know it solely on that basis.
So
Because it's all that's the falsity of the closure principle tells us that there are some cases in which you might not know it. I mean, it doesn't say anything about knowing solely, but
you are talking about X1 through XN.
I don't think so.
Okay.
I mean, it might be that.
Okay. I'll let you finish what you're saying. And then
I mean, if we ask the question, I mean, maybe there's some threat to your knowing that you know it on the basis of the argument. But even then, I don't see exactly what the threat would be.
Are you done?
I think this would replay at the next level.
Yeah.
But in any case, the main point is just I don't see the threat to knowing the conclusion on the basis of those particular premises.
Well, so here's
Even if you can't go through the general argument via the premise.
I mean, here's the idea.
principle.
So suppose that it's, maybe let him respond if I follow. Suppose that the following, so if CP1 is false, then being justified in believing that an argument is sound and believing the conclusion of that argument because it's the conclusion of that argument is not sufficient for you being justified in believing the conclusion.
Right.
So the arguments that do justify the conclusion, there must be something else for it to be sufficient. And that's why I said I thought we were back to x1 through xn. And x1 through xn is just stipulated to be whatever else you'd have to add to get a sufficient condition.
I wasn't denying that there might have to be some argument,
Yeah.
so some general principle of the x1 through xn form. Maybe, maybe not. I mean, that's a finitely statable principle. I don't know that its existence follows from what I've said, but that doesn't mean you need to know that this is an instance of that longer principle for it to be true, that you know the conclusion on the basis just of A, B, C. That's my point.
I don't disagree with that. So here's how kind of the dialectic went the way I saw it. Being justified in believing that the argument is sound, believing the conclusion on the basis of the conclusion of that argument is not all by itself sufficient for us to be justified in believing the conclusion. I then point out that that's quite surprising. Like, it's quite surprising that, say, being justified in believing everything Dretske says and seeing that entails that CP1 is false is not sufficient for being justified in believing CP1 is false. Then I said, once you recognize that it's not sufficient, then I said you should be unless you know what x1 through xn are, you should be agnostic about which arguments are the ones that do justify their conclusions, which ones are in that privileged subset.
You also said nobody knows anything on the basis of argument because of this argument you're making.
I said I was going to assume that I was going to assume that the arguments for the falsity of CP1 had nothing going for them beyond being justifiably believed to be sound. I said then I'll return to that later, and I returned to that later with x1 through xn. So I said let's just assume that the most they have going for them is that they're justifiably believed to be sound. Then if CP1 is false, then they don't justify the belief that CP1 is false. There must be some other feature they have. What could that be? I said we don't know. At least one person in this room thinks he does know.
Sorry,
but
I yield the floor in just a second, but I'm getting a little bit confused in all the dialectics. So just take a simple case. Sorry. I know, let's say I know on the basis of perception that P, and I know on the basis of perception that Q, and so I come to the conclusion P and Q.
I love that.
And I think I can know that on the basis of P and Q, and if you want to throw it in, my knowledge of the validity of the P, Q, therefore P and Q. I think all of that is completely consistent with the falsity of that closure principle you stated. Are you denying that or no?
I think once you commit to the falsity of the closure principle, then you should become uncomfortable with whether you do know that P and Q on those bases.
Why?
Because look, I mean, you can't just know anything for the heck of it, right? I'm like,
no, I know it on the basis of P and Q.
Easy. that colon, I was about to. You can't know anything just for the heck of it.
Role reversal.
Like, how do you know P and Q? I think the answer is because you have you have an argument for P and Q whose premises are justified and an argument that's self-evidently valid. That's a great answer. That's why we agree that you know P and Q. When it turns out that that answer is not sufficient, then I think you should step back and be like, I don't know what I should say then. I think you should be agnostic at that point. Unless you think you've got your sensus argumentatus and you can just tell this is one of the good guys.
I better stop.
Okay. All right.
So I wasn't hearing a commitment to, let's call it, automatic agglomeration, which for knowledge says if you know P and you know Q, you know P and Q automatically.
Right.
Even with that. And you were saying, you implied that you definitely didn't want to believe that in the case of justification. And It made me worried about some things he was saying. So I'll go to the knowledge case first. You said that a counterexample is going to have to be a case where you know the argument sound. But you can't say that without automatic agglomeration. What you had was that you know the premises are true and you know the argument's valid, but without knowing it sound is knowing that conjunction, but you don't have automatic agglomeration. So there might be cases where you don't know it sound.
Yeah.
And so
I love that.
That's one thing. That
Can I respond?
What's that?
Can I?
Can I just say the other thing? Just, you also had the makings of a counterexample, I thought, in your discussion of the premise. Suppose 37's the magic number in the story that I'm about to tell, and I'm lazy and I ask Ted 37 questions, and the 37th question is whether a certain argument from his answers to the first 36 questions to a certain conclusion is valid. Well, since 37's the magic number, I get to know the conjunction of the first 36. I get to have justified belief that all of the first 36 are true, and he's pretty good on validity, so I'm justified in believing the argument's valid. But by hypothesis, I can't justifiably believe the argument sound, because that would get me to the magic number of 37. So I'm not even it's not just I haven't thought about it, I'm definitively not justified on your vision in thinking the argument sound in that sort of setting. So I'm puzzled why, you see where I'm going.
Yeah. So let me answer the sound. I think the second one, there's something else going on in it, the second comment, so I'll respond to them separately, I think. I'm going to give two different responses to your first question. The official response is I was using sound as shorthand for valid and has all true premises.
That's great.
And
That's what I
you
thought.
would notice, or maybe you would, but all the closure principles, that sound doesn't appear in CP1. It's you're justified in believing has all true premises. And so I think in a way the move to soundness we don't need. I will say this though.
No, but you had justified in believing all the premise are true and justified in believing the argument sound. You never had justified in believing the conjunction. Valid. You never had.
So let me start over. CP1 says you're justified in believing all the premises are true.
Right.
And you know that they entail the conclusion.
Right.
And you believe the conclusion on the basis.
Right. But
That's sufficient, according to CP1, for you to be justified.
Right, but you don't like automatic agglomeration, so you might not know the argument's valid, and you might not be justified. You might not know the argument's sound, and you might not be justified in believing the argument's sound. You need automatic agglomeration to give you.
So let me start over. There's a second response, but I feel like you're not hearing the first response. The first response is, then forget I ever used the word sound. Here's the view that I'm really defending, and that's why I left it in CP1. If you're justified in believing that all the premises are true, and you know that the premises entail the conclusion, and you believe the conclusion on that basis, then you're justified in believing the conclusion is true. I never used the word sound there. Didn't have to know anything about sound.
That's correct.
I use the word sound in the paper because it's a way to condense all of that. That's the first thing. Second thing is, if you want to, I'm happy to add you believe the argument is sound. I'm happy to put that in there for you. Mm-hmm. It better not be, and someone who hates closure could say, well, just because you're justified believing it's valid and justified believing it has true premises doesn't follow that it's justified believing you're sound. In a way, that's fine for me. That's just more fuel for my fire that they can't even know which arguments they have are sound. And so that's a threat to the practice that we think we're all very comfortable with. So two separate responses. One is we could just drop the word sound from the whole thing, which is what I was intending to do. It's why I left it out of CP1. Paper's much easier to hear if I summarize. But the second thing is, if you really want to push and you say, no, CP1, I don't believe that. Here's what I believe. If you're justified in believing the argument sound, then blah, blah, and believe the conclusion for the right reason. Then you're justified in believing. I'm fine with that too, because I think pretty easy for us to go, thoughtful people like ourselves, to go from justified in believing that it's has all true premises, justified in believing that it's valid, to justified in believing it's sound. And if you deny that move, then again, that's just more of a threat to the practice of giving arguments.
You think justification agglomeration isn't generally true. You think yourself that there are situations where you can be justified in believing an argument's valid, justified in believing all its conclusions, all its premises are true, but not justified in believing the conjunction, the argument's valid and all the premises are true.
I see. So you think so here, can I put your objection this way? You say that I'm justified in the conclusion if I believe the conclusion based on, so it's kind of a basing relation, believing that it's valid and just knowing it's valid and believing with justification all the premises are true. And you think the basing relation should be a bit stronger.
I'm going to shut up.
Okay, because that's the way I did it. That's the way I. Was the 37 a different objection or just the same?
It was an illustration
Okay.
of the fact that you don't like agglomeration for justification.
Okay.
I just wanted to ask you to say a bit more about the respects in which you find things like the Kruski argument, the Zebra argument, the BIV argument disappointing.
Yeah.
You say it's consistent with my view that
Yeah.
these arguments will come as a disappointment to us.
Yeah.
Perhaps if we, after asking, how do you know that you're not a brain in a vat, for example? And I thought, and there's particularly if we dress up these arguments with all the remarks in your paper and say, this defensive closure, and if we put that in the mix, would that no longer be a disappointing answer to how do you know I'm not a brain in a vat?
Well, I think if you dress it up with everything in the paper, none of it's disappointing. It's all fun.
As an answer to how do you know that you're not a brain in a vat?
No, so I think it's disappointing in a particular way, right? And I'm just saying, imagine someone walks in the room and they say, forget even knowledge, just do it with justification. I'm justified in believing that any evidence against Musk's being currently alive is misleading. And we're like, how could you be justified? And I think we would all expect some cool story that he's heard about some conspiracy or she's heard about some conspiracy, blah, blah, blah. And if they just say, because it's entailed by something else I'm justified in believing, that Musk is alive, we're like, it's like an annoying
I agree, we would be disappointed, but I'm just wondering, what is this do you have any theory about or views about what this feature is?
Well, the Kruski argument and the Zebra argument are alike in their disappointingness, and they're also alike in that anything that would defeat the conclusion would also defeat the premise, the key premise. And I think that's part of what's going on there, as opposed to say, I believe any evidence against Musk's having died recently is misleading, and I believe this because I have justified belief that hackers are going to post evidence to that effect. When I see the New York Times webpage and it says Musk has just died, that confirms my premise about the hackers. It doesn't defeat it, right? Because I knew it was coming. I think that's part of what's going on. That's part of the phenomenon. But I don't know what more to say about it.
Anything that would defeat my justification in believing the conclusion would do likewise to one specific premise. Is it important that it be a specific, or can it would do likewise for my being justified in believing that all the premises are true? Because the worry would be that...
No, I mean, well, in those arguments, a couple of the premises, I think, are pretty secure from defeat. I mean, I'm assuming you can't take it with you. Yeah. And if Musk is dead, he's not one of the richest people. That seems pretty secure.
Yeah. Thanks for this. This was really interesting. So this could end up just being more of a comment, at least unless I'm misinterpreting something. So towards the end of this talk, you talked about the connection with preface and lottery cases, and I think I agree with you that the first closure principle is not susceptible to lottery paradoxes in the way that the second closure principle is. And I'm just curious if you would agree that these kinds of arguments tend to not just they actually tend to give you reason to think that we can know certain lottery propositions, or that we can have very good so in epistemology, usually people start with, suppose I could know that my ticket is a loser. I give you this multi-premise closure principle, the kind of principle that I take it you're denying, and from that I can give you really absurd results, like that I know that every ticket will be a loser.
Or you just, or you could do all the a premise for each ticket that you know is a loser, and then you could deduce the winner from that. Then you know.
Oh,
the winner.
oh,
All
sure.
that would be terrible.
Yes,
but,
right,
But I think
right.
you can't know all those premises are true. So.
Yeah. So I agree, but I just think so. This is why I think this might be more of a comment. What I thought was kind of an interesting, what seemed to me an implication of this, is that usually epistemologists want to give us reasons that we can't can't know lottery propositions and things of the sort. But I take it that an argument, there's going to be a parallel argument like this, which is going to give us really strong reason to think that we can believe lottery propositions.
No, so like in John's book, right in the intro, he has this argument, someone giving it, I can't afford a fancy vacation, points out that entails, I won't win the lottery. I think that's exactly right. I think you can know that conclusion is true.
Yeah, you can know that it's true.
If
Okay.
you know the premise.
Good. Yeah. I actually, one thing that I thought was interesting here was just that we now have, there's always been this kind of dialectic where people say, yeah, you can't know lottery propositions because I have this closure principle. It would give us terrible results. And now, as a result of your argument, I think, yeah, actually, maybe we have this other closure principle, which is basically inconsistent with the agglomerative closure principle. Because if you believed in both, you would end up with the result that you can deduce the winning ticket and so forth. So yeah, this was
That's
partly
why
just
the preface section's there.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, then I agree, and it's more of a comment.
Thank you. Really interesting talk. Can you hear me? I was wondering if you could just say something about what belief is, or its role, or its purpose, because I think the answer to that question will affect how convincing I find CP1. And I have some possibilities, but I want to hear what you think.
You want me to give you a theory of belief, its role, and its purpose?
Well, any one of those things. Yeah. How about? You don't have to give for all. You just have to give each.
Can you give me something to work with?
Okay. Yeah, sure. So here's a theory that I think makes me find the closure principle convincing. So maybe, and don't just say yes because because it helps you, but this would help you. So here's one theory of what belief is and why we like it, why we have it as opposed to some other states. Maybe to believe something is just to form a picture of the world. So if I believe P, then I include P in my picture, and I rule out not P. This kind of picture, and maybe there are reasons that I do this, and this kind of picture would make the closure principle attractive, because if I know that if P is in my picture, and I know that if P is in my picture, then Q's got to be in my picture too, then it's sort of just by definition, Q's already in my picture. So if I have a picture in which I'm looking at a zebra, it's got to be part of my picture that I'm not looking at a mule.
Yeah.
But and then there's some other, I don't know. So that's one theory.
Notice that I'm not, the closure principle I'm defending has to do with closure of justification. Right? So it's funny, you're saying things about belief and saying, if I believe this, it'll be included in my belief. That's not really, I don't know what that is. It's a closure claim about belief parts or something, but I'm just talking about closure of justification.
Oh, well, okay, so that's a good picture for me to have, or that's that's what it is to be justified. I don't know. I mean, I'm in part asking you because maybe I don't sort of like the idea of just starting with, okay, we have this mental state and we have some intuitions about it. Let's try to capture those. I think I more like the idea of we have this mental state and it plays some important role in our life, either our epistemic life or our practical life, and then we can sort of see some facts about whether it's good for the state to be this way or that way. Will sort of follow from that. But I mean, you might just say that's the wrong way around. We should start.
Well, I mean, part of me agrees wholeheartedly with you that we shouldn't start and end with an intuition, So I think, and so I think it's bad to start and end with the intuition that I don't know, it's not a zebra, it's not a mule disguised as a zebra. I'd want to think systematically. For me, the systematic thinking, to the extent that it's there, isn't about the nature of belief, but it's thinking, we give arguments all the time for conclusions. We count those arguments as it were evidence. Dresky and as, I mean, evidence can mean a lot of different things, but we count them, why do you believe that? Here's my compelling argument. Why do you believe those remedies? Here's why. Oh, I see why you believe that now. And so keeping that practice firmly in mind and acknowledging that we recognize that as like a good way to form beliefs in lots of cases, then why isn't that on the table when we look at the zebra argument?
Okay, good. So that's
that's the systematic thinking.
That's a good, helpful answer. So that it's the belief has this role in producing arguments. Look at the arguments we actually produce. They follow this format or something like that. Thanks.
I'm not sure it's so implausible that we have a sensus argumentatus that enables us to somehow just know whether x1 to xn in CP1 plus are satisfied. We seem to have an intuitive sense of validity, kind of maybe sensus validitatis, so to speak, that allows us to judge whether arguments are valid. It's not perfect, but it's pretty good, and logic refines it. If we have a way of just knowing whether an argument is valid, in short, just knowing whether or not the second conjunct of the antecedent of CP1 plus is true, then why not also the fourth conjunct of the antecedent, namely that x1 to xn are satisfied? I suppose strictly speaking, the second conjunct of the antecedent is that we know that the argument's premises until its conclusion. But I guess my broad point is if we can just judge validity intuitively, why not also x1 to xn, whatever they are?
I think one thing I really want to point out is that people who reject closure and do it because they give the zebra argument, give those three claims that I have from Section 3 about justified, not justified beliefs about zebras, deduce from that CP1 is false, defend lots of other arguments, and then we put out the zebra argument and we point out that, look, this is what you've been doing all along. You've been having justified premises and recognizing validity and endorsing the conclusion on the basis of that and assuming the conclusion was justified. Why can't I do it here? And they respond, my sensus argumentatus tells me this is a bad argument. It tells me the others are good. I'm okay if that's where the dialectic ends. Mm-hmm. I think that I feel like, I don't know, do we have to do it case by case? Normally we throw arguments out there and we just follow the arguments, and we form justified beliefs that way. But yeah, you could say that.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for the talk. I think I'm actually convinced by your argument, being the kind of person who gets convinced by arguments.
Thanks,
and I take it the strategy is basically to say, look, if these arguments show that you have to deny closure, the cost is too high. It just proves too much. So that means that you don't have to go back to these arguments that move people to deny closure and explain what's funky about them. But I wonder if you might want to say something, because it seems to me they're funky in different ways. Like in the Kresge argument, I'd be inclined to say if somebody, sort of argued me into a corner and got me to agree that if I accept the premises, I have to accept, or sorry, not the Kresge argument, the Elon Musk argument. I'm inclined to say, you know what, when I stated the first premise, I misstated it. What I really mean is there's an amount of money that belongs to this guy Elon Musk or his estate, and it's the largest amount that has ever belonged to any. So I might want to backtrack and just say, look, I was being a little bit careless about the way I formulated my argument. There might be something different wrong with these other arguments, but do you accept any responsibility for going back and seeing what's unsatisfying?
That's what I kind of, at the beginning, that's what I tried to do in Section 1 a little bit.
Okay.
I was like, you might think, so here, And so you might think, since you wanted to restate premise one as it's stated is not a justified belief you have. But then, of course, your epistemic situation is not a counterexample of closure.
Right.
So my thought was there'd be lots of things that could be wrong with them. But for them to be counterexamples to closure, a lot has to be right. You have to be justified in believing they're sound, or more carefully, justified in believing all their premises are true and knowing that the premises entail the conclusion.
Thanks for the talk. Simple question, I think. You said that you. You said in response to Lara that you're interested in thinking about closure of justification. And so I was just wondering why in the formulation of CP1 and CP2, actually, it's always closed under known entailment. So you've always got like justified in believing or no in all the other clauses except for what our attitude towards the entailment itself.
Yeah.
What would you lose if you added
Nothing.
justified in believing or no?
I mean, what I would lose is it would depart a little bit from the standard literature on closure, which is typically closure under known entailment.
Okay.
Is the way it's described. I think that's fair because that's the way it usually gets discussed.
Yeah, that seems right.
But I'd be perfectly fine with justified belief that it's valid and so on.
Okay, so you still get what you
That's
want.
a little bit
That's
again.
a little weaker,
And so maybe I should loosen it up a little bit. But I was just trying to stick with the kind of standard literature. Okay. Yeah.
John raised the question of when agglomeration is justified. If you accept what a certain definition of belief is to believe P is to believe P more probable than not P, that will give you the answer very quickly, and the answer to the premise very the paradox of the preface very quickly. You can believe of each of the arguments in the book that they are valid, etc., without believing that the conclusion is valid, because you believe that it is more probable than not that each of the arguments are valid, without believing that the conjunction of them is valid. But this depends on a certain analysis of belief. But given that belief, it does sort things out, and it follows, therefore, that any argument from more than one premise is not automatically agglomerable. I mean, it follows from you're justified in believing P that you're justified in believing Q if P entails Q. But it doesn't follow from you're justified in believing P and you're justified in believing Q that you're justified in believing P and Q. And that will apply to any argument which is such that the conclusion can only be drawn by using the material of more than one premise.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah. I do want to say that sometimes we are justified in believing that all the premises of an argument are true.
Oh,
in
yes,
some
but
cases.
It doesn't follow from that you're justified in believing that the agglomeration is true.
Hi there.
Hey, Jordan.
I just have a clarifying question. I want to get clear on exactly how these examples are supposed to be counter arguments to closure. Is the idea that in each case we're not justified in the conclusion, but we should be by closure or CP1, so it must be not CP1. Alternatives could be something like, sort of along the same, something like, we've gone very wrong if we can bootstrap in this way, or if we get something like the Kresge argument where it looks like a lot of evidence becomes misleading or like anti-confirmed, or it shouldn't be. Along the lines of Louise's question, I guess, how's that supposed to work?
So I'm not 100% sure of the question, so let me say a couple of things.
Sounds good.
So the arguments themselves aren't meant to be counterexamples to closure. The arguments themselves are meant to be involved in counterexamples to closure. Counterexample to closure would be what I've been calling an individual's epistemic situation, where they're and the arguments would be involved in an example of a counterexample of closure if your epistemic situation is such that you're justified in believing that all the premises of one of those arguments are true. You know, or Andrew may be justified in believing those premises entail the conclusion. You believe the conclusion in virtue as a result of, because you know all that, and you're not justified in believing the conclusion. That would be a counterexample to CP1.
Gotcha. I guess I was thinking along the lines of Louise that what I'm inclined to say has gone wrong in each of these arguments is a little bit different.
Yeah.
And I guess I'm wondering, like, do you have like a pithy, like, here's why not closure?
Well, in terms of the arguments, it's what I would say is, yeah, maybe lots of things go wrong with them.
Okay.
But you only get a counterexample to closure if you're justified in believing all their premises. You only get a counterexample to CP1, that principle. If you're justified in believing all the premises, you know the premises entail the conclusion. And also, interestingly enough, they're not circular in the way I spelled out, where you could only be justified in believing the premise in virtue, if you're already justified in believing the conclusion. Because if that's the case, then we don't have a counterexample to closure either. So my thought was you got to make a lot of assumptions to even get them up and running as a counterexample to closure. And once you make all those assumptions, I then claim you should just say, I am justified in believing the conclusion.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, thank you very much for your talk. So this is kind of more of a clarificatory question. There's one thing I'm kind of a bit of the dialectic I'm a bit unsure of. In terms of, so like, things like the brain in the vat argument would normally be presented as kind of, like skeptical arguments if you take the kind of modus tollens of it. And I'm kind of wondering where your views kind of, and where your arguments kind of sit in like the dialectic with like the radical skeptic in this kind of sense. Because it seems in a way you're trying to argue the cost is too high of thinking these things give us like counterexamples to closure. And it's just like, they're too high in that they lead to a kind of radical skepticism. But these sorts of arguments are often thrown out there by, radical skeptics. I'm wondering, should the skeptic be rubbing his hands with glee in a way here? Or is there something else you're offering us to, why we should think we're, not brains in a vat?
Well, it's certainly true that closure is a tool in the skeptic's toolbox.
Yeah.
And I've just been defending closure. And I feel like that's enough for one talk. But if you want, I'm happy to go out on a limb and say that I know I have hands. And follow the arguments where they take me, like a good philosopher. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
And that you're not going to win the lottery?
I know that too, yeah.
Just checking. All right. Is that it? Okay, let's thank our speaker. Thank you, Trenton.